Hello. It's the 4th of December, so we now have just 8 days to go until the big general election 2019, the Christmas election, the December election, the Brexit election, the climate change election, whatever you want to call it. Um, it will stand out simply because of the time of the year and because of in every election we hear it's vital, it's a once in a lifetime election, it's historic, etc. I think this one particularly is because of the Brexit deadlock and because of the fact that the two main candidates really are polar opposites. I mean, no one can say that Corbyn and Johnson look, sound, or have the same ideology as one another. One really is a true blue Tory, the other really is, red socialist. So, at least if nothing else, that is a good thing. There's a clear contrast. So if you really hate socialism, then not to vote for Corbyn. If you really hate conservatism, not to vote for Johnson. And of course, that's disregarding the whole middle ground, where many people will not want to vote for either. But realistically, and as optimistic as Joe Swinson wants to be, realistically, only Jeremy Corbyn or Boris Johnson is going to be the next Prime Minister. I think if Johnson wins, then he will. I don't know if there'll be a fixed term parliament, but I can't see another general election for some time, probably 5 years. I reckon after this one, the next general election won't be until at least 2024. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we do need a bit of a space now. But the stakes on this one are very, very important. Rather than making a video digesting my stance on each party, I just want to talk about what seems worth talking about from my perspective. And for this video, I want to talk about my stance on Corbyn's Labour. I've spoken a lot about this, um, but coming up to an election is a sort of fresh opportunity to do so. And this is just my opinions. You don't have to agree. You can disagree, whatever. It's just my opinions. I believe a healthy democracy must have a left-right pendulum with a centre ground as well. And right now, like I say, we actually do have that on some level because we have a clear left-wing Labour Party under Corbyn and we have a clear right-wing Conservative Party under Johnson. Johnson did, of course, recently say that he thought austerity had went too far or had been a mistake or something to that effect. I don't believe that for a second. I think it's a way to try and get Labour voters. If Johnson really felt that way, why is it taking him to a general election, weeks before a general election, to say that? I don't buy it for a second. I mean, he was a senior figure in the Cameron and May governments. The May government, he served as foreign secretary. So I just don't buy for a second that he was sort of a passive observer. It's almost laughable. Of course, with the nature of an election, you're going to get a lot of accusations and counter accusations. The terror attack at London Bridge, I mean, people say don't politicise it. To be fair, I think it's hard not to politicise it because terrorism is a major issue. And for Nicola Sturgeon to say, oh, these men are politicising it, well, so is she by, hailing the Scottish Government's record on early release, saying that they've had a better record. So she's politicising it as well. But anyway, I derailed. I want to focus here on Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party. I'm not 100% decided on who I'm going to vote for, but I am swaying heavily towards going for my local MP, Julie Elliot, Labour. And this is why. I've never voted Labour. I'd always been probably Lib Dem or Independent. And I have major misgivings with Jeremy Corbyn, which I'm going to come into in a minute. But I'm looking at Julie Elliott as an MP, and I think she's a decent MP. I think she works hard. I feel that she played an important role in the committee scrutinising reality TV in the fall of the Jeremy Kyle scandal. Now, if you've seen my videos on Jeremy Kyle, you'll know that I have very strong views on that. So for my own MP to be directly involved in a committee scrutinising that, I'm grateful that she is. It's important work. It's holding ITV to account for how they allowed this to happen. So I'm grateful for the work she's doing on that. Um, Although Sunderland Central is a strong Labour seat, I mentioned this in my video about tactical voting and so on. I never sort of say, oh, well, they're going to win anyway, so I'll vote for them. That's never my logic. But I am going to vote for her because I think overall she's a decent MP, she's hardworking, and I have no major reasons to be, opposed to her. I haven't seen any policy positions or issues that I would really strongly take issue with. I'm not saying that it won't be. I'm not saying that there won't be things that she says or does that I might disagree with, but I don't think she takes it for granted. I mean, I think there's evidence that she works hard all year round. The Tory candidate hasn't even bothered. I mean, the guy's resident in Kingston and Surbiton, so that indicates to me the Tories aren't even going to try in Sunderland Central this year. I don't expect candidates to be born in the city. People move around, but to not even be, living in Sunderland, to not even have any obvious connection with the city, just seems like they're not even bothering to try. So that's another thing swaying my vote towards Labour this year. Now, having said that, I'll be quite honest. If I vote Labour, Jeremy Corbyn gets in, I'll feel a degree of guilt because I do have some pretty big contentions with Jeremy Corbyn. And I should add that Julie Elliot had no reference to Corbyn on her election material. I've got 3 leaflets from her, not a single reference to Corbyn. Um, I think she'd probably be described as centre ground Labour. I wouldn't call her an ultra Blairite, but I wouldn't call her a Corbynite either. She's just standard Labour. That's the impression I get. Whether she would describe herself that way or not, I don't know. But anyway, um, there is a lot of things that Corbyn has come out with I cannot disagree with. So, for example, yesterday he was talking about holding Britain's worst companies to account for the way they treat their employers. A company like Amazon, for example, is absolutely rotten. Sports Direct is another one. These are companies that have rightly come under huge fire for the way that they have treated their employees. I do not trust the Tories. I do not trust the Tories to be on the side of employee rights. Whatever they say, the Tories are a party of business, and that's not a bad thing. Business has its place. But when it comes to big business versus employee rights, I will always trust Labour before the Tories because their history is based on workers' rights. Whatever you think of trade unionism, that is the point. So I will always trust Labour before the Tories when it comes to that. And I'm not saying Labour's record is perfect, but I think they have their heart in the right place. Um, I think a lot of the promises Labour are coming out with, need to be taken with a pinch of salt. It is election time, and all these things need to be paid for. Um, And I think it's kind of like a cycle because the media, in a sense, pressure politicians to come up with big ideas, but then politicians and political parties, they do make grand promises that they can't keep. The problem is, if a political party says, well, we want to be honest with you, we cannot make huge promises, then people would say, oh, they don't stand for anything. So you can't have it both ways. We as voters cannot, on one hand, say, oh, they don't stand for anything, but then say, oh, the promises are too big. I think there needs to be a situation whereby they they give enough optimism to vote for them, but also enough reality to say we cannot deliver everything. We cannot give everyone everything. We just can't do that. So I want to see. It sounds like an oxymoron. I want to see honesty. I want to see straight talking. In that sense, a lot of the things that we're hearing from Labour sound great, cancelling tuition fees. I got a letter from the student loan company the other day, and they really are unscrupulous the way they go about things. I mean, they send pretty much threatening letters, warning of penalties if you don't respond. I made it very clear to the student loans company what my situation was. I even wrote a handwritten letter to make it more authentic to the Glasgow office last year. I still get these semi-harassing letters, and it's stressful because it makes you think, oh, am I going to be dragged into court? Well, just for the record, I've done a bit of research on this. If you're in this position, the student loans company not paying your student debt off immediately, it's counted as a civil offence. It's not a criminal offence. But I mean, if you're like me, you're not in a position to pay it. There's actually nothing they can do. So the way I'm taking it is, I've already made it clear to them what my situation is. I'm not going to, um, I'm not going to pander to their threats. I think that's unacceptable. So if Labour, for example, is making promises to write off student debt, that sounds great, but we need to know clearly how that's going to be done. Um, so it's my responsibility, obviously, to look at the manifesto. But then what's said in the manifesto and what can be done aren't always the same thing. Um, Domestically speaking, I think that there's positions that Jeremy Corbyn has that, who can argue with? Who can argue that homelessness is a terrible thing and we need more compassion as a society? Who can argue? And I know Julie Elliott's spoken strongly on this. If you're someone who's been through the welfare system, as I have, if you know how cruel and bureaucratic the DWP can be, the sort of rhetoric that Jeremy Corbyn is promoting, it's hard to disagree with. When it comes to, for example, the treatment of claimants, I do trust Corbyn more than Johnson, definitely, because I think that not just Corbyn, I think, particularly Corbyn, I have to say, I mean, this is one side of his left wing credentials that I have to say, maybe, just maybe, needs to be injected into our political establishment. What I mean by that is that there's kind of this, we're hearing all these polls saying, oh, Johnson's on course to win a majority and so on, and they might be right. But I don't like the idea that the Tories are kind of born to rule. And part of me, despite my misgivings about Corbyn, which I'm going to come to in a minute, part of me thinks a Corbyn victory, a socialist party, at least a socialist-led party, maybe, just maybe, shaking things up for a while is not a bad thing. Because I think there is this kind of assumption that Conservatives have that they're born to rule. They'll deny that, of course. But I think it's no bad thing proving the pollsters wrong and shaking things up a little bit. And maybe a bit of left-wing populism isn't entirely a bad thing. Is it really going to be any worse than Tory austerity? The damage that Tory austerity has caused for 9 years, which Priti Patel so shamelessly tried to dismiss. I mean, whatever way you look at it, whatever angle you come from, whatever way you gloss it over, it's irrefutable that rough sleeping has increased on the Tory watch. That's just a fact. It is irrefutable that the cuts have had a hugely detrimental impact on public services. Again, it's just a fact, whatever way you look at it. And I'm well aware that there are Labour extremes that can cause problems in the other direction. If we look at the 70s, strikes that were apparently never ending and seemingly brought the country to a stalemate. So it's a gamble both ways, but I do believe fundamentally Labour cares more about the most vulnerable in society more than the Tories do. That's my gut feeling. That's not to say there aren't individual Tories who do care. I believe there are. In fact, I know there are because I personally know of Conservatives who are very active on human rights issues, for example. But when it comes to issues like homelessness and treatment of claimants, treatment of disabled claimants in particular, I think fundamentally Labour can be more trusted. I think the Tories, they get, they grimace when they're accused of being a party for the rich, but the average Conservative is far more likely to be vocal about a welfare claimant, cheating their benefit money than they are about massive banking bonuses. Um, and that to me just says something about their radar. I'm not saying, people should cheat their benefit money. That's wrong. It shouldn't happen. But to me, it's just a question of where Conservatives' priorities lie. They are more likely to get angry with that than they are with undeserved banking bonuses. So to me, there is just a fundamental survival of the fittest mentality among Conservatives. And I know that's a controversial thing to say, but that's how I feel. Now, having said all that, so that's my position. I think that Corbyn's domestic um, ideology fundamentally is more compassionate and is fundamentally more interested in those at the bottom of society. But, and I haven't even got into economic policies and all of that, but I would say this really briefly. If someone can afford to open a second business, then they can't really complain about paying the minimum wage. I understand if they're a small business, say with 4 employees, and they really are just like a family-run business. I do understand there's pressures on those people. I totally am sympathetic to that. But if they're able to open other branches, then I take a dim view of them whining about having to pay the minimum wage. Why? Because if they can afford to open other branches, they can afford to pay the minimum wage. So, um, now, where's my contentions with Corbyn? I have quite a few. Um, One of the things that Corbyn supporters always come out with is to blame the right-wing Murdoch press. Well, it's no mystery, it's no secret that the right-wing Murdoch press is going to be critical of any Labour leader. I mean, they gave Ed Miliband a very hard time of it. They pilloried him for that ridiculous sandwich thing, which I think was a load of nonsense. They called him Red Ed. It was merciless the way they covered Ed Miliband. Brown, again, very critical of Gordon Brown. So there is a long history of the Murdoch press being critical of Labour leaders. And so some of it definitely needs to be seen as blatant bias. Although you could probably argue the same with the Daily Mirror and Conservative leaders. But that aspect is definitely there. But what I would say to the Corbyn supporters is how do you explain them when left-wing people who have never voted Conservative in their life, who are very anti-Murdoch press, are also critical of Corbyn? How do you explain that? I've even seen left-wing people who are very left-wing, and their criticism of Corbyn lies in the fact he's quite weak from their perspective. They don't think he is assertive enough as a leader. So it's not necessarily that they disagree with his politics, they just don't think he's strong enough. And I would tend to agree with that. I think sometimes Corbyn comes across like a former polytechnic lecturer rather than a leader of a major party aspiring to be Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. So it sounds like a sort of shallow point. I don't think it is. I think you need to show strength as a leader. Now I'm not going to say that Corbyn is. I think to be in the position that he's in, you need tough skin, especially with the level of criticism he's got, personal criticism. So I don't think he's necessarily weak in that sense, in a personal sense. I think it's more weakness as being an assertive leader. And I think he's sort of allowed himself to be in this little bubble of, loyalists and kind of phased out the critics. I do think there is some very uncomfortable things going on within the Labour Party right now. The anti-Semitism thing is a very real problem. But there's other things. I think the centrists are being pushed out. And I have a big problem with that because they have as much right to call themselves Labour as, the hard left do. So I have a big problem with that. And it gets really vitriolic at times, like Blairite traitors. You just see this in Corbyn circles. They really are vitriolic. They almost hate what they deem to be Blairite traitors even more than they hate the Tories. And yet it was the government of Tony Blair that brought in the minimum wage. It was the government of Tony Blair that saw the longest sustained growth in the post-war period. A lot of things that it was the government of Tony Blair that brought in equality legislation, a lot of things that you would think traditional left-wing people would support. But I think in foreign policy, that's probably where a lot of the criticism lies. But anyway, so there is that sort of intolerance among Corbynites that I think is a very big problem. And Jeremy Corbyn himself, his response has been, for example, when journalists have been booed, to be fair to Corbyn, he has reprimanded people. He said they have a right to ask questions. And he has also said that in parts of the world, journalists are killed for doing their job. So I think Corbyn has, on a personal basis, I don't think it's been a case of he's tried to silence the media or anything like that. I don't think anyone can honestly accuse him of that. And I mean, some of it has been very personalised. The doorstepping techniques, I think, are vile. I don't think that should be done with any politician. But with Jeremy Corbyn, there is a fundamental trust issue with the wider public. I think it lies in this. Corbyn supporters get very angry when, for example, he's called a terrorist sympathiser. But whatever way they gloss it over, it is irrefutable. This man has a very shady record when it comes to dealings with terrorists. I mean, the argument that he went to Northern Ireland, or he went to Ireland in the capacity of a peace negotiator, Jeremy Corbyn was a backbencher. He wasn't anything to do with the Foreign Office. He wasn't a diplomat. He had no reason to go there in a capacity as a backbencher. His attitude to Hezbollah, the whole "my friends" thing, that was not a diplomatic gesture. That was ideological sympathy. Because if you're going to argue that was a diplomatic gesture, because this is something I have a big problem with Corbyn, like, you're fundamentally dishonest. If the whole "my friends" thing was a diplomatic gesture, why doesn't he also say "our Israeli friends"? Jeremy Corbyn, it's just been revealed, has accused the BBC of bias simply for saying that Israel has a right to exist. And yet, you can say this with any other country, it would be just non-controversial. Why don't the Israel haters use the same logic with Pakistan? Pakistan was a Muslim homeland created in 1947. What's the difference? So why is there this obsessive focus with Israel? But anyway, I digress. To be honest, I could talk about a lot of things here. So Corbynites, they have this kind of block. They've got this mental block where they just dismiss everything as a right-wing smear. His relationship with terrorists, it's not good enough to say, oh, he condemns all violence, he condemns all terrorism. This is the point I would make. When Jeremy Corbyn is very specific in his criticism of the far right, as he is, it's not good enough to say, oh, well, he condemned, for example, of course he condemned the London Bridge attack. He's a senior politician, he has to. But Jeremy Corbyn has never uttered the words Islamic extremism. He has never uttered the word Islamist ideology, the term Islamist ideology. Now, that, to me, is not a trivial thing. That, to me, points to an ideological problem with Jeremy Corbyn, in that he simply doesn't recognise it. He doesn't recognise that there is a problem with Islamic extremism. Because to Jeremy Corbyn, if you talk about Islamic extremism, oh, it's dog whistle. It's blaming all Muslims, which of course it isn't. So there is political correctness doesn't even do it justice. I think Corbyn, and it isn't just Corbyn, it's his front bench, Diane Abbott, John McDonnell, they have a very troubling tendency to really pander to identity politics. In my view, identity politics is toxic. It causes nothing but division and animosity in society. And Corbyn's front bench fully endorse it. So I am very wary of that. Corbyn has a track record of backing regimes, governments, parties, and organisations that are vociferously anti-West. Corbyn chaired the Stop the War Coalition for years. He wasn't just a member, he chaired it. This was an organisation that shamelessly served as apologists for the Assad regime while they denounced America and Britain. Now, to me, that is absolutely unforgivable. His attitude to the Salisbury attack, kind of acting like the defense lawyer for the Russian Federation, saying that, oh, we need to hear Russia's perspective. I mean, for a potential prime minister waiting to take that position after a powerful, hostile foreign adversary commits an attack on our soil, leading to the deaths of two British citizens, I mean, that was state terrorism from Russia. And it's not good enough to say Corbyn was simply being neutral. If you are a senior British politician, that should be a no-brainer. You don't be neutral when it comes to Russia. So I think that Jeremy Corbyn has a very, very troubling track record when it comes to foreign policy. This is a man who backed the Venezuelan regime. Look at Venezuela. Humanitarian crisis. Millions have fled. Has the third highest homicide rate in the world. It's a complete humanitarian crisis. And that is a model that Jeremy Corbyn has quoted. Now, his supporters say, oh, Corbyn isn't going to create a Venezuela in Britain. But he has praised the Venezuela model. It's just a fact. So what I find deeply frustrating is we have a leader here who I think has his heart in the right place when it comes to domestic issues around the homeless, around the unemployed. But you know, you can feel strongly on those issues and feel also strongly about national defence. I do not trust Jeremy Corbyn when it comes to the defence of the nation. I mean, it isn't just about Trident. You know, there's Nick Clegg was hostile to Trident. Nick Clegg can hardly be seen as far left. So I don't think it's just about Trident. I think it's also about NATO, for example. I think Jeremy Corbyn has a very troubling track record, and so does his inner circle, Diane Abbott, John McDonnell. I mean, John McDonnell has downplayed Stalin's crimes. Jeremy Corbyn is advised by Seamus Milne, who's an outright Stalin apologist. These are not trivial things. These men have stood on platforms with placards that are openly praising Chairman Mao and Joseph Stalin. Imagine for a second if a senior conservative appeared on a platform with neo-Nazis. So the Corbynites need to take the blinkers down and accept that this is not a right-wing smear. I mean, take for example the IRA thing. Corbyn was asked 5 times to specifically condemn the IRA and he would not do so. What he should have said was, we now have peace in Northern Ireland, that is something that needs to be welcomed. I totally acknowledge that the IRA, along with the loyalist organisations, committed some heinous acts of terrorism. Corbyn would not specifically name the IRA. Why not? And I don't accept the argument he was just trying to be neutral. Because this is a man who, like I say, specifically talks about far-right organisations. Now, when it comes to Corbynites, there's no... I don't think you can reason with them. Because as soon as you raise these things and say, oh, you're just regurgitating right-wing smears, but they're not smears. There's ample evidence to show this. And as for the anti-Semitism issue, I do believe it's a very serious problem within Labour. Yes, Labour councillors who've been accused of it have been kicked out of the party. Yes, there have been actions taken recently. And I personally feel that if someone's accused of it, of course, you know, they need to have due process. There needs to be the evidence there. But I do think there's substantial evidence to show that there is a very serious anti-Semitism problem within Labour ranks. It's not just one or two individuals. I think there's a real problem here. And I think part of it is because Labour has, in recent years, pandered to, I want to be careful how I say this. I was going to say the Muslim vote, but not all Muslims think alike. But there is a segment of the Muslim community who do hold very anti-Semitic views. It's just a fact. So I think Labour has kind of turned a blind eye to that for a long time. So summed up, I'll be voting Labour because of my local MP. I think that Corbyn and his party offer a lot more than the Tories do when it comes to helping the most vulnerable in society, and that's extremely important. But it just depresses me, therefore, that Corbyn is simply his track record speaks for itself. Corbyn has always been against Britain. This is a man who has never, and I defy his supporters to show me an example of this, has never been on the side of Britain when it comes to any dispute. Not once. He has always played the devil's advocate for the other side, whether it be a hostile foreign government, whether it be left-wing terrorists, whether it be Islamists. Corbyn has always played the devil's advocate. I mean, he spoke against, for example, the targeted killing of Baghdadi, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Corbyn's idea was he should just be arrested. Now, how does he propose that is done in that sort of situation in a firefight? Oh, excuse me, Mr. Baghdadi, we're just arresting you with an international arrest warrant. He had a suicide vest on. So, at best, Corbyn is naive when it comes to these things. And at worst, I think he really has a troubling. I mean, I don't believe that Corbyn actually believes, for example, in Islamist suicide bombings. I don't think he supports that. But it is irrefutable that Corbyn has a track record of being anti-West. It's just a fact. Look at his track record. And I defy his supporters to say otherwise. So to me, that's the tragedy about the Corbyn leadership of Labour, is that he is a genuine left-wing leader who sounds all the right notes when it comes to the way that people are exploited, treating the homeless with compassion, dealing with this problem, food banks, all those things I can get on board with. But his attitude to foreign policy does not sit well with me, because it's perfectly compatible to want all those things to be addressed at home whilst also caring about the country. And another fun that I'll close with this, Corbyn's attitude to the union is vague at best, a bit like his attitude to Brexit. Now, with Brexit, I can kind of excuse that, because one might argue, as John McDonnell did, that that's that is actually leadership to understand both sides. But when it comes to the union, to me, a British Prime Minister should be that should be non-negotiable. A British Prime Minister shouldn't kind of give the SNP this idea, oh, we might give you a referendum, we might not. A British Prime Minister should be absolutely, unwaveringly, ideologically supportive of the United Kingdom. And in that sense, I do trust the Tories a lot more. I trust Johnson a lot more than Corbyn when it comes to the union. And that maybe is more critical than anything, because with no union, no country, then what is the point of any of it? To me, the union rises well above party political policies. And I know Corbyn said that he has no plans to prop up the SNP or to go for another referendum. But his attitude in the Sheffield debate really wasn't inspiring. It was very vague at best. Not good enough. Johnson's attitude is, there is not going to be another referendum on my watch. That's what I want to see from a British Prime Minister. You know, the Scottish people had their say. It was a once in a lifetime referendum, as we were told over and over again by the nationalists themselves. We cannot have a situation where there is a referendum over and over and over again until the nationalists get their way. No way. So that's my comprehensive thoughts on Jeremy Corbyn and his front bench. And I'm sure there will be other things that I haven't said that I could say. If you put up with me all this time, thank you for watching. Leave the comment section open, but no doubt it will create fireworks. Keep it civil.